This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. We have a new podcast joining the Storyworks family in early 2021. The Storyworks Reading Series is a literary journal for the ears. Every month, an author will read a new short story or lyric essay. Then sit down with me to discuss its inspiration, the writing process, and challenges. Storyworks Reading Series is a podcast that gives voice to your story and you. Let your writing and reading friends know about Storyworks Reading Series, and if you're a writer, go to storyworkspodcast.com/submit. Read our submission guidelines and send us something. I am so looking forward to reading your work and even chatting with you on the podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert and I are joined by Carlee, who is filling in for Catherine. So this episode, we are talking about your opening scene and the way in which it sets up the reader for everything to come, the central goal and problem of your story. This came up because I was talking to a coaching client about his opening scene. He's writing contemporary fiction with a strong romantic plotline. And so I mentioned Sleepless in Seattle. And okay, it's been a while since I've seen the movie, but my memory of the opening scene is that Meg Ryan is listening to the radio show where Tom Hanks is talking about his deceased wife, and she's in tears. So immediately we've got a hopeless romantic who really needs true love in her life. So there's our protagonist, her central goal, and, little do we know, or little does she know, the guy on the radio is her love interest. So it's all packaged neatly there in that opening scene. And then another example I used also with the romantic element is the opening scene of Grey's Anatomy, the very first episode where Meredith is in a bar alone. She picks up a guy. She takes him home for a one-night stand. In the morning, she doesn't even know his name, but she has to kick him out because she's late for her first day at work. She gets to the hospital where she's a brand new surgical intern, and lo and behold, her one-night stand is her boss, one of the surgeons at the hospital. So we've got, the central character, her two central problems. One, she doesn't have love in her life. She's messed up and confused about relationships. And two, she's got this high-pressure job with a lot of stress around performance. And they all come together in that opening. So can we safely say that you must always have your core goal and your core problem present in the opening of your story, no matter the genre? Is that an absolute?
I think if you don't, you risk leading the reader down a trail that then has to turn at some point to get to the real story. And isn't that what we often advise? We often say, you've got to get past the throat clearing to get to the real story, or start with chapter 3, or all those cliches about what do you do with your first draft, or why do we keep going back and rewriting that first chapter? It's probably because we feel it's missing the spark that ignites the story, and it may not be a thing that sends them off into their extraordinary world. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that the first hook has to mirror to some degree the structure of the bigger problem of the story.
Right.
And we all, isn't that the delight of a great work, is when you get to the end and it hits you like a gut punch. You go, because that makes so much difference because of what was long forgotten, perhaps because it's 5 hours, 8 hours, 14, however long it took you to read it, and that might be over the space of months for some people. It might be a day for others, but they harken back to that start point, which then either consciously they remember how it started, or unconsciously it hits because it closes some emotional loop that was left open.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, from my point of view, I think great works always do that.
Yes.
Because that would be my definition of a great work, would be that everything gets set up at the start. But is that easy to do? Now we've got a whole series of shows about that, I think.
Right. I think I can remember some beginning attempts having a sense in some longer works of fiction I've worked on something to shoot for, and then making the mistake of kitchen sinking it, right?
Yeah,
of throwing all the elements in. So not only do we meet our protagonists or even our central, point of view protagonist, but then we learn, just an armload of the character's foibles and fears and past and the problem that might be coming, and it's too much. So I think getting back to what you're saying, Alida, is what is the essential thing? And in the two examples you gave, the relationship piece or the romance piece end up being the most important things in those two stories, right? Because one could argue that Grey's Anatomy, while it is a medical drama, right, that it's about relationships. It's about all the different relationships in the show, and that's really the thing that adds the most, or that is maybe the fundamental level of the emotional stakes. Like, yes, the medical, if we use this, as an analogy, the things that happen in the hospital are plot points, but the relationships and the tensions between the characters is really why you continue to keep watching the show.
Yeah.
Right. And the opening scene really needs to signal to the reader what the story is about. And if it misses that mark, if it goes, if it touches on backstory or if it touches on subplot instead of the core of the plot and character arc, then the reader might feel misled, like they invested in the beginning of the story expecting one journey and got another. If we can, use Grey's Anatomy again, Meredith's mother is a renowned surgeon, and so she's got a lot of pressure to live up to that mother's reputation. Her mother is also in a home with Alzheimer's, but her mother only comes into this story as a subplot character. She's part of Meredith's emotional baggage. We do eventually meet her down the road. But if we had started with the scene with Meredith and her mother, yes, we would have gotten into the character. We would have known something about her starting point on this journey. But the story's not about Meredith and her mom. It's not about living up to your parents' legacy, right? So I think it's easy for writers to miss that mark by looking at some other aspect of their story that feels like an entree into the novel, but just isn't central.
I think so too, that as a writer, you want to show something about your character right away, something important about your character. And I was going to say this earlier too, related to a different point, that you want to make sure your character's humanity is out there right away. I think to allow the reader to feel some connection to your character, or even curiosity, even if you don't feel connected early on. But when showing your character's humanity, it has to be the right aspect, as you're saying, Alida, not just something that is important in the realm of all the things that are important to that character's characterization, but also what is the essential thing, or what is the thing that is going to drive that character and her decisions, and then the consequences of those decisions.
Right. Yeah, I think drive is a great word to keep in mind.
From like narrative drive, you mean the momentum of the story?
Yeah, and also the character's motivation, the protagonist's psychological deep driver, as well as, if we look at it from the plot angle in both of those examples we've discussed so far, it drives the momentum forward into the plot, as well as revealing the protagonist driver, whether it's being a hopeless romantic in search of love or being, this urgent need to perform and not screw up your life and establish relationships that are meaningful. So,
yeah, I think, this tells me that one thing to do first is to zoom out to genre. And by genre, I don't necessarily mean marketing genre, but, what is the story's essential plot? What is it? Was it trying to get across? So is it a performance story? Is it a status story? Is it action adventure? And they will determine, I think, what the opening scenes should start to contain in terms of expectations. And I'm thinking back to writing book descriptions. One of the things that when I'm editing other writers' book descriptions, one of the things I'll zoom to very quickly is what the description of the genre is in the final paragraph, and then come back to what is the opening statement we've made about the main character, and does that match? Because it's all very well to illustrate needs and wants, but if they're irrelevant to what the genre is trying to capture for the reader, because the reader's reading that genre for a certain emotional experience. And so I think that's what we're trying to get through in that first chapter. And the mistakes that I see being made, not just in book descriptions, but in a synopsis, for example, is that the author will have a thought of something clever to start the story with, which is kind of cool to read, but it really doesn't do anything except maybe show a character quirk. And that character quirk itself isn't essential to the main driver of the genre either. Maybe it's a romance or something like that, and it shows them, having trouble with their car, but it's in the big scheme of things irrelevant, as you say. Like Meredith, if Meredith spent time with her mother and there was all that going on, you get, well, it might be interesting, but and Carlee said it extremely well. It's not a medical thriller. So you come back to genre. The show is not a medical thriller. It's not a medical suspense. It's not a medical detective story. It's a show about people and their relationships, and probably mostly from that. It's about love. So, of what we strive for.
Right, and it's set against the backdrop of the medical
it's a setting
world, right? And so, that is the setting. And so, yes, on one level, the show is about this high performance life or death environment, but it's really about the relationships and love. There was a line, I don't know which episode but early on, where somebody, probably Meredith in her voiceover, says they went from high school to college to medical school to this, like they had 12 years of school beyond their 12 years before college. And she made the point that they're all emotionally stunted. So they get into the real world finally after all these years of just focusing on school. And they're like teenagers trying to build relationships, like they're, in their 20s and 30s, and they don't know how to handle themselves emotionally. It was said in this very pithy, clever, beautiful line of voiceover, but that always stuck with me because it made such a great point about the show and what the show is really about. It's about people navigating relationships.
There we go. So the answer to your first question then is probably still yes. Do you have to have it? And I like what Carlee said is yes, you do, but you don't want to go cramming everything in there, and it's what was that thing I was remembering about that? It's about trying to tell somebody everything at once, and you know that after you've hit them with the first thing, the rest of it's just going to fall on deaf ears. So it's that teasing.
Right. And I think I got so wrapped up in the example from Grey's Anatomy that I didn't quite come all the way around to my point. But I think a pitfall for writers is seeing the surface of what the story is about and not presenting to the reader in that opening scene the heart of what the story is about, the thematic about, that intangible slice of humanity that it's all really about.
Yeah, we said it in your intro of Sleepers in Seattle. You know, we don't have someone who's necessarily looking for the love of their life. She doesn't know that she needs that. She doesn't even necessarily know that she wants it, or maybe all that she knows is there's some emptiness that's resonating. So we haven't even come out and blatantly said, you know, I'm looking for a new relationship. You know, so it's not heavy-handed. It's really subtle. Yeah. Well, when I say subtle, it's not it's not subtle to the viewer because the viewer gets it, but we know the character doesn't. So, and I think that's clever art, you know.
Alida, you brought up a good point. Oh,
you just muted there.
Oh, pardon me. You brought up a great point about how when we see Meg Ryan's character and Tom Hanks's character in that opening scene, that we know that they're the main characters. So I think that's another pitfall that we writers need to avoid, which is introducing, you know, you have the character who is your hero, who is your protagonist, doing something in that opening scene, and then there's another character with that character, but that character doesn't end up being that important. Right. I think it depends. I think some of that has to do with genre expectations, and how many characters end up being in the story. But say there's an incredibly emotionally charged scene in that opening scene that involves the protagonist and someone else, but then that other character doesn't end up being that important. I feel like that also feels like, you know, that the writer has unintentionally misled the reader to start feeling something for this other character, start forming opinions, and then that character becomes not that important at all.
Yeah, that's a really great point. The spotlight is on the protagonist, of course, but then any other character you bring into that scene becomes spotlighted. They share that spotlight, and so you need to make certain they're important, just like Meredith and Derek. If she had had a one-night stand with a random guy from the bar who didn't end up being her boss at the hospital, it would reveal something about Meredith's situation with relationships, but it wouldn't be central. It wouldn't have that drive to move the story forward the way it does when, surprise, he's your boss.
Right. And it would have been especially ineffective if imagine that scene in which Meredith is having a one-night stand with some random guy. We learn his name, they have a conversation, and then she goes to work and whatever else. Because then already we've had too much exposure to details about this character who ends up disappearing from the story.
Right.
Even though it's telling us something important about Meredith or something intriguing about Meredith as a character. It's too much about the other irrelevant thing. And that applies to details too, right? Not just characters, but other details, or even, I feel like I've seen this oftentimes and tried to avoid it myself with setting. How important, you know, does the setting end up, too much upfront about the setting end up detracting from what we're picking up about the protagonist and about the essential nature of the story, about what the story is going to be about? Do we get kind of caught up looking at the landscape and not feeling pulled forward by what actually is going to matter in the story? Which isn't to say that setting is not important and that it can function in a very important way. Of course, we know this, but to front load that in a way that either slows down that opening scene or dilutes it, I think that's also something to avoid when you're doing that charged scene in the beginning or that all-important opening scene.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's important to remind everybody that when we talk about your opening hook, you know, hook is such a jargony piece of terminology that you think it has to be big, it has to be explosive, or it has to be super romantic, or it has to be high tension. It can be very subtle, but it has to intrigue the reader, draw the reader in, engage and involve the reader. So that's all we mean by that. And you might have a lyric style of prose that's extremely descriptive, where you create portraits of your landscape, and then that might be a great way to set your opening scene, because it signals to the reader, this is the journey you're going on, this is the type of novel you're going to read. but you also have to make certain, as you were saying, Carlee, that there is forward thrust, that you aren't getting lost in the landscape and neglecting that through line that draws us into the plot and character arcs.
Right.
You got to pare it all back, haven't you? Nothing unnecessary. It's the Goldilocks chapter, really, or the Goldilocks opening anyway. Everything just in its right place. And I suppose for many writers as well, if you do write linearly, this might be the first part of the story you drafted. And so, you know, as we become more familiar and intimate with storyboard writing, sometimes I feel like my latter parts of my drafts are always much better. And so that's why you come back to the beginning and that's so weak, it's pathetic. And it's probably because, Alida, it's missing those important points. I've started somewhere that I thought was interesting and cool, but actually it's missing that strong emotive moment. And whether it's a little thing or a dramatic scene, it doesn't matter. But as you say, it has to have an emotive moment that attaches us to the main character, that propels the story forward, that connects to the main theme, that is genre appropriate. And that's no mean feat to juggle all those things at once, you know.
That does a lot of work. Yes.
Yeah.
It does.
It's heavy lifting for just a few pages of text.
Yeah. That's actually, I think that's great, Robert, to reemphasize that if you're feeling stuck writing your opening scene, don't write it. Go into the rest of your story and then return to it. This is something I've tried before with short stories, that you'll know, like you said, I mean, I'm just reiterating what you said, but you'll know better what needs to be there and what is essential and what isn't after you've gotten more acquainted with the rest of the story. I think that's good. I think that's a good way. That's a good tidbit to get unstuck, right? Or to stop spinning. If you're spinning your wheels on your opening, go somewhere else.
Right. And you mentioned being precious, I think, in our last episode, Carlee. And I think to relate that to what Robert was saying too, we can start our stories writing linearly by writing ourselves into our story. So we might start the narrative before that moment that is crucial, that signals the core of both the plot and the character. And, you know, if we did some nice writing there, we might feel precious about it. Like, no, the story starts here because that's how I wrote it. But really, you're just writing yourself up to that point that is going to effectively hook the reader, engage her, and you know, signal what the story is about, thus allowing you to come full circle at the end and land that very satisfying resolution.
Yes.
Yeah, this is why I think we see films that come out with director's cuts, you know, because they didn't like what was done editorially. I mean, normally they have control over that. That must be such a difficult role where with a writer, you know, you sat there with your computer for the most part, by yourself for a long period of time producing something and then pouring over it and you know it inside out. But you think about the thousands of people or hundreds of people that are involved in a massive movie production like Sleepless in Seattle. And then there's that, you know, they get to the editing stage and the director says, no, I don't like that first scene. Well, are they going to have to reshoot it or is this going to the cutting room floor? So we don't know, you know, when we're looking at Grey's Anatomy or Sleepless in Seattle, we don't know what they may have started with. They may have started with a scene that didn't hit anyone's heart at all. And somebody may have said, no, that doesn't work. You know, we need to show them more emotional. We need to show them, you know, having that, you know, deer in the headlights moment. And we had too much of Meredith's ordinary life there. Now let's cut straight to getting into bed with someone, you know. So I think that's part of what you have to do when you're in editing, when you're in revision. Don't worry about it when you're drafting, but when you're in revision state, definitely go back to that beginning moment and take a good hard look. Is this grabbing the story, you know, by the proverbials and moving it forward in a way that mirrors the ending, you know? So.
Right.
Yeah, and I think there's another lesson we can pull from Grey's Anatomy's opening scene. While there is nothing unlikable about Meredith, we see major flaws in that opening scene. You know, she's drinking alone, she's picking up a guy, she's taking him home, they're sleeping on the living room rug, she doesn't know his name in the morning. We get that there are some emotional wounds going on with this woman and that they're going to play out. This is part of our journey. Whereas in Sleepless in Seattle, Meg Ryan was America's sweetheart for so many years. And so you see her face and it's just, aw, isn't she wonderful? Isn't she lovely? And as writers, we can want to put our character's best face forward to the reader. So, okay, I'll introduce the problem, but don't forget about your character's flaw as well. Not that you must absolutely have that flaw in the opening scene, but don't shy away from it. It can be powerful.
Yeah, I think that's what I was hoping to say, but you said beautifully, Alida, when I said your character's humanity.
Humanity.
Yes. That there's
Totally.
just like that there has to be something, has to be something about the character that we connect with, knowing that the character is not beyond reproach and this untouchable figure. That's not most of the time, unless there's a larger purpose for that, right? But that's a particular frame, that's a particular conceit of a story. But in this, and sometimes a setup to be utterly dismantled. But in ways to connect with our characters, showing their flaws, showing what they're up against, showing what they're not doing that great at, I think is always a way to, at the very least, interest the reader, or at least make us lean closer.
I think that's
Yes.
exactly where I'd start, Carlee. I think, I'd forget about anything else. Plot setting, I would be thinking, what do I need to establish as the character's humanity? And, well, which is well said. What are their needs? What are their wants? What do they know what do they think they're after, and what are they really needing? And where's that? I think that those are wonderful ways to start the story.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Core want, core problem.
Well, because without that, you're just writing.
Yeah.
Without that, you're just writing a pretty, kind of interesting thing, which might have some appeal. And this is the problem, if we're looking, really in this show, I think what we're after is what's high art. Where we want to push the craft to that grabs the reader and brings them in. So yes, you can start the story without doing any of that, but is it going to be mediocre? Is it just going to be popcorn? Is it just going to be something they put down and then search for another author?
Right.
And all of us come to this, very difficult art that you spend weeks and weeks and weeks poring over, agonizing over, and then someone in a 1-star review says, I hated that. Oh, thanks. Oh, man. We're doing it not because it's easy. We're doing it because we have a love of story. And so those ones that stick in our minds, just as the two examples you've used, that are, TV or film related, but we've all got memorable books that stuck in our minds. It's because those little extras came through. And so I think that's really what we're saying is, you can do it with just an interesting opening scene. But if you really want to establish yourself as an author that people want to come back and read more of their work because they love the voice, then these are the kind of things that really make a big difference to a story, in my opinion, which is always, very big.
Yeah. I think humor operates that way too, when it comes to voice. I'm thinking back to a show that you guys did a few weeks ago, or maybe even a couple months now, talking about various aspects of A Man Called Uva. And then also the novel Eleanor Oliphant is Perfectly Fine. Are you familiar with that one?
I haven't read it. It's on my TBR.
But that's another example to use, A Man Called Uva, protagonist who at first seems pretty prickly and unlikable. Same thing with Eleanor, the title character, and Eleanor Oliphant. And but they're so quirky and the voice is so well done and the humor is there and subtle and dry that is the essential thing you learn in the opening scene, right? That sets up an expectation and you want to follow where that's going to go. So there's this character you're not sold on yet, maybe, or you're maybe a little repulsed by, but where are we going with this humorous voice that's kind of beckoning us along to the next chapter? I wish I could do that. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe I should try that sometime just as an experiment. See how flat it falls.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a great experiment. Okay, writing prompt, everybody.
Writing prompt, yes. Unlikable character, use some humor, right?
Yes, yeah, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier about the opening scene establishing what this journey is going to be like for the readers. So yes, there's the plot arc and the character arc and those core elements, but there's also that voice. You know, are you setting rich? Are you big on description? Is it a humorous story? Is it, right? So what is going to draw the reader into your piece? And even, do you remember the very opening scene of Uwe? Was it one of his suicide attempts? Was it like, I'm not sure how soon they got to that. You know,
it was early on.
It was early. In the book. Yeah, it was suicide attempt was very early on. In the book, I think he's actually in the computer store buying the iPad.
Right.
Yes.
Which you forget about, and it comes back at the end, of course. So
right.
It does, but that was intriguing because he was such an unlikely person to want a computer. He was so clueless. He was so irritated by and irritating to the salesperson, which was humorous. And I wanted to know what this guy wanted the best iPad money could buy for, because he clearly couldn't use it. He couldn't even turn it on. Right.
Right.
What was interesting about it, to point, how the juxtaposition between the cranky character and the humor there is that he came into it with this alien idea. He had no idea, and he asked the really obvious questions that all of us have probably stopped asking. He says, well, why did somebody want this?
Right.
Yeah, well, that's true. We've just been brainwashed. So, okay. And you're saying he does this
or something.
Yes.
Like he was so clueless.
So yeah, that's a good example, Carlee, I think, of the fact that you can see the humor in it in amongst his. He doesn't realize he's being funny. That's the interesting thing about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny to us. Yeah.
Right. Well, and it's an example of an opening in a prologue form, because we then jump back in time to before he knew his neighbors, before he had regained purpose in his life, when he was just the suicidal widower. And if we didn't have that Apple Store scene to pique our interest before we met the depressed suicidal widower, we might not have wanted to go on a journey with that character. But we see that he's going to end up in this very unlikely situation. And we've already been gripped by the humorous voice of the piece, the narrator, and so we're much more open to meeting the curmudgeon, policing the way people park.
Yeah.
Do we just run dry? Do we have? Is that it? If you just listened to the StoryWorks Roundtable, chances are you're a writer. So grab that story or essay that you have been polishing, refining, crafting, and shaping for an audience of readers and listeners, because I would love to read your work and see you on the other side of this microphone. StoryWorks Reading Series gives voice to your story and you. Submit now at storyworkspodcast.com to be published in 2021. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.